So the first dimension that Erin Myer describes in her book, The Culture Map, which I strongly recommend to those of you who like or who are interested in intercultural communication, is uh, actually communication. She distinguishes low context and high context cultures. And it is important to say that she didn't really come up with it. These dimensions did exist before her research, but this is one of the dimensions that she thinks really affects how business operations are conducted in different cultures. So the main difference between the low context communication and high context communication cultures is in how much of the information is being said explicitly versus how much of that information is implied or assumed to be known by participants of a given conversation. The United States is actually one of the cultures where communication tends to be very, very low context. Everything is very explicit, and there's no need to read between the lines as much as it is perhaps maybe needed in other cultures. Russia, for example, my country, is on the opposite side of this spectrum, and communication to be very high context, which means that people tend to omit a significant amount of information and assumes that all participants either already know or somehow understand it. I'm going to describe how a work meeting would work. In America versus Russia. So, in the States, for a business meeting, we get together. We usually have some kind of agenda that was sent ahead, so everybody knows that we're going to be talking about, right? During the meeting, as we go, while we're discussing who's going to be doing what needs to be done, who's responsible for what, there's usually someone who's taking notes, right? And once we made all the decisions, at the end of the meeting, whoever is the moderator of that meeting, they would reiterate the key points. And after the meeting, the note taker would send notes that also would reiterate these key points. And as someone who comes from a very high context culture, this repetitiveness seemed very unnecessary to me. Like, why are they doing it? Like, oh, they stupid Americans. Because in Russia, when we would have a meeting, we would make decisions as we go. When we would end the meeting without anything being reiterated, because everybody was there. Everybody understood what we were talking about. Everybody participated. So no need for repeating the same information all over again. And also, usually there is no note taker and there's no meeting recap being sent after the meeting. Again, everybody was there, everybody knew what we were talking about, so why would we bother, right? Here's another example from one of the TikTokers. Let's watch this video.
This is how to say yes politely in American versus in Russian. Yes, please.
Нет, нет, ты чё? Не надо! Нет! Don't try to convince me! No! Я реально сейчас обижусь! Я обиделась! Ладно, уговорила. If you insist.
So what she is demonstrating here is how indirect a yes can be in a high context culture. Even though she's from Russia, this is a Russian TikToker, but in many other countries or cultures as well that are high context, when someone offers you a treat or a help or something else, you're not supposed to say yes immediately. You're supposed to at first decline it, and if they insist, you would reluctantly then agree. So the assumption behind it is that when a person offers you something, they do it out of politeness, not because they genuinely want to do it. So you're kind of testing them by saying no first. Only if they insist, you would understand that this was a genuine offer, and only then that you can agree to it. Coming from a very low context, very explicit culture, would you be able to understand this behavior or decode what it means? Of course not. No means no here, and yes means yes. However, in high context cultures, it is implied that you know what is behind this initial no. And in other words, you have the necessary context to understand the actual meaning of this conversation. That's why it's called high context versus low context. You can think of high context communication as of inside jokes. You definitely have those types of jokes with your group of friends where nobody from the outside can understand them, but you have the necessary background that's shared between all of the group members for you to be able to decode the meaning of these jokes, right? Now, it is important to understand that regardless of the culture, we use both low context and high context mode of communication. With people that we know very well, like our family or friends, we tend to be a little bit higher context because we know that they know some of the information we're going to share, and there's no need to spell everything out. However, with people that we don't know, not as familiar with as acquaintances, we tend to be a little bit more explicit in order to avoid any kind of misunderstanding. So both modes of communication are present in each cultures, but some cultures on average tend to be higher context or lower context. For example, Western countries tend to be on the lower context side of the scale, whereas Asian countries generally tend to fall on the high end of the spectrum. And why is that? So a lot of it has to do with the country's history and its homogeneity in terms of racial and ethnic background. Younger nation states such as Europe, such as the United States specifically, they're populated by immigrants, people coming from all over the world with all types of different backgrounds. So in order for the state to function, it is important to spell everything out explicitly, what everything means, what the rules and regulations are. The less we have those unspoken rules and the more of them are spoken, the easier it is for everybody to understand them and to follow them. For this reason, it is a lot easier to adopt as an immigrant in those lower context cultures than it is in higher context cultures. Those high context cultures, they tend to be very stable societies with very, very long history, and the people live in one city or one town for their entire life. They stay in the same job for years, they keep old friendships, so they build this network of people, their own bubble, where there's no need to interact with outsiders, and therefore they have a lot of that shared background with the people that surround them, and for them to be able to use this high context mode of communication. For example, when I started driving here in the US, I came here 7 years ago, I noticed that most of the road signs would explicitly tell me, like with words, what they actually mean. For example, this one. So very easy to understand. Speed limit 30, maximum speed allowed, right? Driving in Russia, though, was a total nightmare because there's over 100 of road signs and none of them tells you what they mean unless you know. You have to learn this little book with meaning of all the signs. For example, these three are also speed signs in Russia, and honestly, even I, who has a driver's license, Russian driver's license, I had to look up what each of these mean. So if you're curious, this round blue sign is the minimum speed allowed, so you cannot go lower than that. Then the squared one is the recommended speed, so you can go lower or you can go higher, but this is the optimal speed, so to say. And this round one, the white round circle, is the same as the American speed limit sign. So yes, in many ways, understanding each other as well as the rules, instructions, laws, and things like that are a lot easier in low context cultures. So how do we deal if we come from a low context culture to a high context culture? How do we approach communication? So the first thing that is important to understand is that whatever is being said to us is not necessarily what the speaker means. So we should not assume that the message that they're trying to relay is contained in the words spoken. We always have to read the air. Another thing is we need to pay as much attention to what is not said as we pay to what is said. We're going to talk a little bit more, give you some more specific tips about it later on. If you're coming from a high context culture to a low context culture, let's say from Asia to the United States, it's a little bit easier. You just have to understand that there's no message beyond the spoken word. So whatever the speaker says, that probably would be exactly what they mean. So that's kind of easy, right? But be especially careful when communicating with people from other high context culture, because the context, the contextual cues would be still different between even the high context cultures. Now, the next dimension that we're going to be discussing is evaluating. And it distinguishes cultures with direct negative feedback versus the cultures with indirect negative feedback. And this one actually adds a very interesting twist to the low versus high context communication. So, as we already know, the United States is a low context culture, meaning that most of communication that happens within the culture is very direct and explicit. But this is not really the case when it comes to giving negative feedback. In other words, a criticism that the person at whom it is directed may not like. Now, let me illustrate this with an example from my life. So, one day I went shopping with two of my friends. One of them was an American, and the other one was Polish. This is a culture that's very, very close to Russia, Eastern European. And so our Polish friend, she picked a few dresses and asked us to help her choose which one she should get. And while she was trying her dresses on, our American friend kept saying things like, "Oh my God, you look amazing. Oh my God, you look so cute." And she was saying it about literally every single outfit that our friend tried on. And in my head, I was thinking, like, how is this helping? If I'm there, if I went shopping for my friend, I feel like my job is to have her pick the best of the best and have her spend as little money as possible. That's what I thought was what being a good friend means. My American friend was trying to be encouraging and supportive, and in her head, being a good friend meant just that. So she was avoiding giving any negative feedback completely. Thank goodness our Polish friend, she had lived in America for over 10 years at that point. So she knew that both of us were trying to be good friends to her, just in our own different ways, right? And so she was actually the one who shared this picture with me, and it still makes me laugh. So whatever is in junk and objective distribution is a good start here in America. Whatever is a little bit better than junk, whatever is okay in America, it's pretty good, and the rest of it is awesome. Whereas for Eastern Europeans, we're like, nope, I don't like it. I don't like it no matter how good it is. So yes, we are like that. So now that you know that, please don't take the feedback from your mean Russian professor too personally. So while my American friend chose not to question our friends' fashion choices, in a work setting or in an academic environment, it's very difficult to completely avoid giving negative feedback. If a student receives a grade that's lower than what they expected, or if an employee expects a raise or promotion and not getting it, they're going to need an explanation, right? The way that it's done in some cultures where negative feedback tends to be a little less explicit is sometimes called the sandwich technique. You probably have heard about it. So you open the conversation with something nice, then you throw in a criticism, in a very gentle form. Or like, this is a minor thing that you might consider changing or something like that. And then close with another nice or positive thing, right? Another strategy that can be used to soften the negative feedback is the use of downgraders. For example, if one wants to make if the feedback stronger, they would say something like, "This is totally unprofessional." In this case, totally is an upgrader word. It makes it sound stronger. If we use words such as kind of, sort of, a little, a bit, maybe, slightly, these are the words that are downgraders. It softens the entire sentence and it makes it sound less harsh. So this is a little bit unprofessional sounds a little less heartbreaking than this is totally unprofessional. The UK is actually one of the European countries that everybody makes fun of precisely for that, for this softening of everything. Here's the Anglo-Dutch translation guide that you might have seen on the internet. I like it because, to me, I would interpret the things that British would say exactly as the Dutch would. So what the British say, "I hear what you say." What the British mean, "I disagree completely." What the Dutch understand, or Russian for that matter, "They accept my point." What the British say, "With all due to respect." What the British mean, "I think you're wrong." What the Dutch understand, "They are listening to me." So yeah, this is a very funny translation guide. You can pause this video to keep reading, but we'll go on. Now, I find this chart very interesting. So Erin Myer described cultures using the two dimensions that we've just talked about, how they overlap. Low context versus high context, direct negative feedback versus indirect negative feedback. So Germanic cultures, countries like Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, plus Australia, which is still close to the Anglo-Saxon countries, but a little bit more direct when it comes to negative feedback than the US, Canada, and the United States. So some people would describe these cultures as blunt, rude, offensive, but for some, they're actually honest, frank, and transparent. So you get to pick whatever you feel. Communication from these people is very, very easy to decode. If you're in a culture like that, just drop the downgraders. Don't use these words like sort of, maybe, perhaps, would you, and things like that, because they communicate to them, they communicate the lack of assertiveness, which is not a compliment at all in these cultures. But at the same time, if you're coming from a country where negative feedback tends to be less direct, don't try to mimic this harsh negative feedback that is common in this culture, just because it is very easy to overdo, and it's a little bit safer to be on less negative side. Now, high context and direct negative feedback, how they interact. These are actually Slavic countries such as Russia, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Southern Europe, France, Spain, Italy, and Israel. So these are very, very complex cultures, and in those cultures, you have to read and listen between the line, yet negative feedback is very, very sharp and direct, and often these people are seen as very, very rude. In cultures like this, it is recommended to drop downgraders, just as in Germanic cultures. Again, the lack of assertiveness, that's what they communicate, the downgraders, I mean, the lack of assertiveness, the lack of confidence rather than politeness. And you can also use upgrader words because that makes you sound stronger and more confident in your words. Again, don't take criticism coming from these people too personally. They're criticizing not you, they're criticizing the idea of whatever you're discussing. But also, it is important to remember that if people from these cultures praise something, if they say they like something, they really, really mean it. And whatever you've done must be really awesome. Now, low context and indirect negative feedback. This is what we're used to seeing here in the United States. This is a very interesting combination. On one hand, it feels like these cultures like subtlety and sophistication when you hear people talking between each other. But on the other hand, when it comes to criticism, you guys get very creative. All these 3 positive for everyone negative, the sandwich technique, using the words such as opportunity, the area for improvement instead of saying weakness. All these things don't necessarily work in other cultures. And in fact, they're often very confusing and seen as insincere and fake. However, if some of you are not from the United States, if some of you are foreigners here, here are some strategies that you can adopt in a culture like this. Of course, use the sandwich technique. Balance positive and negative. And whenever you're saying something negative, try to use the downgrader words, kind of, sort of, a little, and things like that. They will help you to soften the blow. Now, high context and indirect negative feedback. These are Asian confusion countries such as China, Japan, uh, Korea. They're very heavily influenced by the concept of saving face. We're going to be talking about it a little bit later. And also Southeast Asia, Thailand, Pakistan, Latin America. Negative feedback in these countries is very, very subtle. It's very easy to even miss the message completely. It is never given in public. It's considered very, very rude because of the concept of saving face. We're going to talk a little bit more about this concept later on. But even in the United States, your negative feedback can be still given in public if you use kind of like a joking manner or a friendly way of saying it. In these countries, this is totally unacceptable. All negative feedback should be given only in private or even skipped altogether. Say the good and leave out the bad. Remember how we discussed that in high context cultures, people are trained or used to paying just as much attention to things that are not said as to what is said. Here's an example, a specific example that Erin Myer discusses in her book as a strategy to deal with negative feedback, with situations where you have to give negative feedback in those high context, indirect negative feedback cultures. A while back, one of my Indonesian colleagues sent me a set of 4 documents to read and review. The last 2 documents he must have finished in a hurry because they were very, very sloppy in comparison to the other 2. When he called to ask for my reaction, I told him that the first 2 papers were excellent. I focused on these documents only, outlining why they were so effective. I didn't need to mention the sloppy documents, which would have been uncomfortable for both of us. He got the message clearly, and I didn't even need to bring up the negative aspects. So that's how you deal with the things that you would have to give negative feedback about. You take the good things, you emphasize what was good about them, and you don't say anything about the things that need to be fixed. And because these people are trained, are cultured that way, they would understand, they would get your message. Now, relatedly, Erin Myer discusses disagreeing as the next dimension, and she distinguishes confrontational cultures where disagreement, public disagreement, open disagreement is okay, and cultures that avoid confrontation, where it's not okay to publicly disagree with somebody. Generally speaking, countries that tend to have direct negative feedback are the countries that are also generally more confrontational. So you see the same countries: Israel, Germany, Denmark, Australia, France, Russia on the confrontational side. Whereas the countries that tend to give indirect negative feedback generally lean towards the avoiding confrontations, and you can see that's again the case with the Asian countries. US and UK are somewhere in the middle. Russia is a very confrontational culture compared to the United States. And I personally am very interested in politics, and I love discussing politics with my family, my friends, and even strangers, especially if they have a different viewpoint than mine. There is no goal to change anybody's mind, really. For me, it's more for entertainment purposes and for a better understanding of why people vote the way they do. However, I could almost feel how uncomfortable people get every time when I would bring this up during a party or a family gathering. The problem is that American society is very, very polarized when it's come to politics, and no one wants a fight during their Thanksgiving dinner, right? And it was very difficult for me to wrap my mind around it because uh, there's no really a fight. A good argument is never a fight, and it's just a discussion of different viewpoints. And back home, we would almost always have these conversations, and nobody would get upset or anything like that. We would just go about our dinner as normal. What I didn't know back then is in my culture, in a confrontational culture, we learned to separate the idea that we're criticizing from a person expressing that idea. So if I criticize the idea, that doesn't mean that I am disapproving of the person expressing it. Whereas in cultures that avoid confrontation, it is assumed that by criticizing the idea, you're questioning the person, or you're disapproving of the person. So this kind of disagreement gets personal very, very quickly. It is even more the case in Asian Confucian countries, where the concept of preservation of face is very, very prominent. So what that means, they follow the Confucian philosophy, where it is assumed that everybody in society has their own place, their own role. And by suggesting or by criticizing, let's say, an Asian manager during a presentation, criticizing their ideas, you are suggesting that this person does not qualify, or you're questioning their expertise, which to them means that they don't live up or they don't live up to their social role. They're supposed to become competent, and they're supposed to know what they're talking about, and now you're questioning them, and that is very, very embarrassing. This suggests that they don't live as their role prescribes, right? And that disturbs the overall societal harmony, and that is very, very embarrassing. That what is public humiliation is what is meant by the concept of loss of face. So in these societies, it is more important for you to let another person to save their face by not criticizing them, instead of stating, no, this is not right, I think this is the right way to do it. It is less important what's right. It is more important that you remain in harmony with the rest of the people in your group. Now, you might be surprised to find Latin American cultures on the right-hand side of the scale, which means that they tend to avoid confrontation. One thing that's really important to understand, that emotional expressiveness is not the same as readiness to express disagreement. There are just generally cultures that are more emotionally expressive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would be readily disagreeing when some issue arises. There was actually an interesting research on this topic, on the emotional expressiveness of different cultures. So a group of researchers conducted an experiment. So they photographed kids from Pakistan, which is an emotionally expressive culture, and kids from the Netherlands, which is a less emotionally expressive culture, while these kids were playing a card game. And then they asked people from different cultures to look at the pictures, and just by looking at the pictures, to tell if the kids that were photographed if they were winning or if they were losing. And for almost all people from all around the world, it was a lot easier to correctly guess the emotions of the Pakistani kids compared to the Dutch kids. Look at how much more expressive they are when they're winning, right? It's a lot easier to tell that they're winning compared to the picture on the left. So yes, readiness to express emotion does not necessarily mean the readiness to openly disagree. So in fact, there are emotionally expressive cultures that avoid confrontation, and as well as there are cultures that are not as emotionally expressive, where disagreeing publicly and openly is still considered okay. So let's take a look at this chart. We have Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany as confrontational cultures while not emotionally expressive. And on the other end of this confrontation scale, we still have not emotionally expressive cultures like Sweden, Asian countries that are not very expressive but also avoid confrontation. On the other hand, the upper part of this chart, we have the emotionally expressive cultures that are also confrontational, which is the upper left quadrant. Here we have Spain, Italy, France, and so on and so forth. They are emotional and they openly debate, they openly confront each other. And then we have countries that are also very emotionally expressive, but in these cultures, openly disagreeing is not considered okay. And these are more Asian countries, India, South Asian countries such as India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab cultures would also fall into this quadrant, and also some Latin American cultures. So yeah, these are two different things, not to be confused. And here are some tips on how to communicate in a confrontational culture. Always try to not take the disagreement personally. They're not criticizing you, they're criticizing the idea that you are expressing. So don't take it personally. Another thing is disagreement in those cultures is actually an indication of an interest in the topic. Just because a topic is able to generate heated debate, that means that it's super interesting. So it's a good thing. And another thing is, as we've already talked about, distinguish confrontational style and emotional expressiveness. They're not the same thing, so make sure you understand what culture you're in. The last thing that I wanted to mention is if you're not coming from a confrontational culture, don't try to mimic their style. It's always safer to be less confrontational. It's always safer to look a little bit softer. There's a chance that you overdo it and it will become uncomfortable or even offensive. So be on the safer side when it comes to disagreement. If you're in a culture that avoids conflict, be very, very careful. Always give negative feedback one-on-one, never in public. And if you're giving that negative feedback, or if you're confronting someone, make sure to use the downgraded words. We already know what they are, kind of, sort of, a little bit, maybe, perhaps, and things like that. So soften the blow as much as you can. So the next dimension that Erin Myer uses in her cultural classification is the mode of persuasion. And this one's really important for us as PR practitioners, because all that we do in our work is pretty much persuasion. We have to sell our ideas. That's why it's so important for us. So it has to do, the mode of persuasion has to do with the way we structure our arguments in persuasive communication. She distinguishes two types of argument structure: principles first and applications first. In principles first cultures, if you want to convince your audience, then you want to begin from the theoretical explanation, and then you present your conclusions. So you kind of walk your audience through your process of thinking and have them come up with your conclusion. So this is also rooted in the deductive reasoning, so from general to specific. In applications first cultures, you present the conclusion first, and then you go on explaining how you came up with these conclusions, if that's necessary. So this is more based in inductive reasoning, from specific to general. If you don't know what deductive inductive is, here's an example. Deductive: all men are mortal, your proposition. Justin Bieber is a man, your second proposition. Hence, Justin Bieber is mortal, your conclusion from the first two propositions. So that's how you go about conclusions. In applications first, or inductive reasoning, you would start with Justin Bieber is mortal because he is a man and all men are mortal. So the logic is reversed here. So generally, we all use both modes of thinking, inductive and deductive. However, our preference for one of the over the other depends on the educational culture in our countries. In Anglo-Saxon countries, we teach children with the concept first, presenting the concept, and then have them apply it. Like, we give them a math formula and have them practice it. And once you practice and this formula leads one time after another to the correct answer, you will start understanding how this works, the underlying theoretical principle. In Southern and Eastern Europe, including Russia, the educational system is heavily leaning towards principles first. So when I was in school, for example, in a geometry class, we would start with proving a theorem, with proving a theoretical concept, and then we would figure out the formula for it. And honestly, I can see the advantages of it, because even now, I don't remember, for example, how the formula for calculating the area of a triangle, but I remember the logic. So a triangle is what? A half of a rectangle. And we know the formula of the rectangle is very easy. The length of one side multiplied by the length of the other side. So because a triangle is a half of a rectangle, we can just take the length of that rectangle one side, multiply by the other, and then divide it by 2. So that's how I know. So yeah, there are a lot of advantages, like, or for example, if I need to, for some reason, calculate the area or the volume of a cylinder, maybe I would need that. Also, I don't remember the exact formula, but I know that it has to do with the area of the underlying circle, the base of the cylinder, and with its height. And from there, I can figure out the formula. However, I don't know how practical that is still, because we can Google things like that. So there are disadvantages to this too, because, for example, when we were studying English, we would start with studying grammar, learning the 12 tenses of a verb, the sentence structure, and we would spend very, very little time actually practicing speaking. And as a result, a lot of kids in Russia would read and write English just fine, but then would have a hard time speaking or understanding when other people would speak to them. So it's both good and bad depending on the situation. However, when it comes to persuasive communication here in the United States, the idea that I would literally have to spoil my key messages, my conclusions right at the beginning, wouldn't really sit well with me. Like, my logic was, why would I do it? If I say the key points of the presentation in the beginning, why would people listen to the rest of the presentation? But people here view it differently. They say that if you're beating around the bush, if you're talking about your theoretical explanations and all these things that are not really as important as the conclusions themselves, you may lose the attention of your listeners before you even get to present your conclusions. So therefore, you want to say what you want to say first, and then go on and explain theoretical explanations if that's necessary. So that also makes sense. Now, bridging the gap, how do we deal with these cultural differences? If you're persuading in a principles first culture, so you need to just do your homework and understand the underlying theoretical principles, or why something that you are going to say is going to work, why this is going to work. And the fact that something is a best practice in a bunch of other organizations is not really a convincing case. You need to be able to understand the inner workings, why this works in these other organizations. And always explain the underlying principles first, obviously, right? If you're persuading in applications first cultures, focus on your conclusions, on what you want to say, and it's not necessarily that your listeners are gonna be interested in their underlying principles. You're more likely would want to focus on how this is going to work, so exact steps that are following your conclusions. So be a little bit more practical when it comes to presenting your ideas. The next dimension, leading, represented by egalitarian societies on one side and hierarchical on the others, draws heavily on the Hofstede's idea of power distance. Hierarchical societies, or societies with high power distance, value structure and hierarchy, and they accept the fact that power in the society is distributed unequally. They expect that leaders or people on the higher end of hierarchical structure would set themselves apart from the rest of the people by the way that they looked and by the way that they act. And also the way you'd be treated would depend on the perception of people of your place in that hierarchy. Egalitarian or low power distance societies, on the other hand, believe that people are equals regardless of their place in hierarchy. The more the leader blends in with the team, the better. Here in the United States, we actually praise the CEOs of multi-billion-dollar companies who look just like normal people, drive cheap cars, and just generally lead a very normal, typical person's life. However, people in hierarchical societies have very different expectations for their bosses. Here's how a Chinese employee, China is a high power distance culture, describes his experience when they saw their Dutch boss. Netherlands is a low power distance society. When they saw him biking to work in China. My team was humiliated that their boss rode a bike to work like a common person. While Chinese bike to work infinitely more than Australians, among the wealthier Chinese, bikes are not an option. There are plenty of bikes on the road, but biking is for lower classes only. So my team felt it was an embarrassment that their boss rode a bike to the office. They felt it suggested to the entire company that their boss was unimportant, and by that association, they were unimportant too. What's really fascinating in this little piece is that these are people of lower status who had certain expectations that their boss was supposed to be meeting. And it was actually them who felt embarrassed because of their boss's actions. Here in America, we are quite uncomfortable with the idea of a fixed social hierarchy. When we think of hierarchy, we usually think of the lower person's responsibility to obey, whereas the higher person can do what she pleases. So it's more like slave owner situation. But it's not actually the case in those higher power distance societies. It's not only the responsibility to obey from the lower person, but also the higher person's responsibility to protect and look after the people below them. So it's more like a parent-child rather than the slave owner situation. For example, imagine that you've done something really messed up at work that was worth firing for. In a low power distance society, you might expect a one-on-one with your boss, where your boss would, in a very nice voice and manner, would tell you that, the company decided to terminate your employment. That's it. Nothing personal, just business, right? In a high power distance societies, chances are that your boss would scream at you, would yell at you, would call you names, and otherwise express his feelings about your wrongdoing. But at the same time, there's a high likelihood that with all those emotions, nothing would be done, no further action, because not only that, but also the boss would try to do everything um, in his power to make sure that nobody else knows what you did. Because in those societies, when you make a mistake, technically what you do is you follow your boss's instructions and orders. So if you mess up, that also means that your boss messed up. And by extension, he would be responsible for your wrongdoing. In other words, yes, the people at the lower level are supposed to show respect, they're supposed to obey, but on the other hand, on the people that are higher in this hierarchy, there's this huge responsibility to make sure that everything is done the way it's supposed to be done. And that person, also has or bears responsibilities for the actions of the people below him. But where do these different perceptions of power come from? And why do people who live in relatively similar regions like Europe would have very different understanding of how equal or how unequal the society should be? Well, think of the Roman Empire. The Romans built a highly centralized and a very hierarchical structure to be able to manage their huge empire. In this empire, the boundaries between different classes were actually legally enforced, and they even dressed differently. For example, the emperor was the only person in the entire empire who was allowed to wear a purple toga. The senators, people who were below the emperor, were allowed to wear a white toga with a wide purple stripe on it. And then the next class after the senators, they were allowed to wear a white toga with a very thin purple stripe. So you could tell what class a person belonged to just by looking at them. So it was so obvious. Therefore, countries that fell under a very strong influence of the Roman Empire tend to be more hierarchical. These include Spain, these include Italy, France to a certain extent, and maybe some Latin American countries because they were populated by the people who came from the Roman Empire. At the same time, countries populated by the Vikings were surprisingly egalitarian. Actually, Vikings, when they were settling in Iceland, they were able to set up one of the earliest democracies in the world. Everybody was allowed to vote. They would get together in a debating hall. Everybody was able to express their opinion on a certain matter. Everybody was allowed to vote, and everybody's vote would count or have the same weight. Legend has it that when Prince of Franks sent an envoy to negotiate with the Vikings, the envoy came back very confused and frustrated. And they were complaining that they could not find anybody to talk to. Everybody would say they're the chief. And so they just couldn't find the person to talk to. So not surprisingly that the countries strongly influenced by the Vikings are to these days are very egalitarian. And if you enter to a meeting room, let's say in Copenhagen or somewhere in Sweden, it would be nearly impossible for you to spot the boss because they would blend in with the rest of the team so much that you could not say that this is the chief. At the same time, when we look at higher power distance societies, we'll see many Asian countries. And here again, we can point another historical influence that shaped their perspective on power. And this was the ancient philosopher Confucius. So Confucianism is generally all about bringing order and harmony into the society. And Confucius, believed that the mankind would be in harmony with the universe if everyone would understand their rank in a society and would act in accordance with their rank. And he believed that the social order was threatened whenever people failed to act in accordance with their prescribed role. So he developed a very complex system of interdependent relationships with lower levels giving loyalty and obedience to the higher levels, whereas the higher people were supposed to protect and mentor the lower. And even to this day, Asian societies from China to South Korea to Japan, they have a very paternalistic view of leadership, a kind of father knows best attitude. Now, how do we deal with these different perceptions of power? If you come from a higher power distance society into a lower power distance society, there are a few things that you should remember. First, if you're addressing an employee that's not within your department, let's say from a different department, you don't need to copy their boss. If you do that, they would feel like you don't trust them. Now, another thing is the seating does not represent a sitting in a meeting the way people sit, the order in which they sit. It does not say anything about the power situation in this particular meeting, so it can be very random. Another thing you need to remember is when you work on a project, you would only invite the key stakeholders on a meeting, only the people that are specifically involved in this project. You don't need to invite these people's bosses or leadership to participate in the meeting. If you're coming from a more egalitarian society into a more high power distance society and work in that environment, there are a few things that you need to remember. You can't skip the levels. So if you need to talk to a person from another department, even if this person a level below you or several levels below you, you're not supposed to address this person. You are supposed to talk to their boss first. So all communication happens at your kind of level. You don't jump levels up or down. You cannot go to the boss of your boss without the approval of your boss first. Another thing is, if you come to the meeting, the way that the seating is arranged will tell you exactly how the power is distributed. The boss is going to be sitting alone, a little bit separated from everybody else. His right hand, under his right hand is going to be the next person, and his left hand is going to be the person after that. And then the way the closer they sit to the boss, that means the more power they have within the organization. So make sure you acknowledge this hierarchy. You make sure you keep it in mind when prepare for the meetings. And always address the higher level leaders by their last name. Don't use first name unless they specifically asked for it. The process of decision making, in other words, who and how makes decisions, generally has to do with whether a culture is egalitarian or hierarchical. Decisions in egalitarian cultures tend to be made by a consensus. That is, people get together, sit down, discuss, everybody gets their input in, and once everybody agrees with the decision, and then the decision is made. Decisions in hierarchical cultures are usually made by the boss, and because there's no need to build this consensus, there's also no need for a long discussion. So these decisions are made relatively quickly. However, there are a few very interesting exceptions to this pattern. So Erin Myer made decision a separate dimension, with consensual style being on one side of this continuum and top-down decision making being on the other. As you can see, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Germany are on the left consensual end of this scale, and so they were on the egalitarian versus hierarchical dimension. Russia, India, and China are on the far right of the deciding scale, and they were on the right hierarchical side of the previous dimension. But let me combine these dimensions, egalitarian versus hierarchical, leading with consensual versus top-down decision making, and show you a couple interesting twists. So as you can see, countries that are egalitarian or low power distance tend to also have a consensual decision-making style. So they're in the top left quadrant. High power distance countries tend to characterize by the top-down decision-making style. But then we have the United States, which leans towards a more egalitarian culture, yet its dominant decision-making style is still top-down, which means that responsibility for decisions lies on the boss. And Germany, which is more hierarchical than the United States, yet is highly consensual. How does this work? Here's how an American executive describes his interactions with the Germans when his company was undergoing a merger with a German corporation. "These Germans are incredibly hierarchical," Nicola exclaimed. "I had lunch, just lunch, with one of the Munich-based analysts and later got my hand slapped by his boss's boss because he's several levels below me and I hadn't followed the proper protocol. Who cares what grade level he's at? Well, I learned one thing. These Germans do." And here's how a German manager describes his experience during the merger. "These Americans give you the impressions that they're so egalitarian with their open door policies, first name basis, and casual dress. Don't be fooled. They are much more hierarchical than we are. When the US boss says, 'March left,' the Americans all click their heels and turn left. No question, no challenge. And if you're German and you dare to challenge your American boss, as is so common in Germany, don't be surprised if you find yourself one step closer to unemployment. I know it's true. It happened to me." So as you can see, Germans are more hierarchical when it comes to interactions and formalities within the organization, but they expect to be included in the process of decision making and have no problem challenging their boss in case they disagree. We also remember that they are a culture where disagreement is expressed openly. At the same time, American executives are okay being on a first name basis with their janitor, yet they feel no obligation to their team when it comes to decision making. What's interesting though is that decisions in top-down cultures where the boss is the one making the decisions are a lowercase d, meaning that they can be revised and changed as new information comes in or the decision maker changes their mind or reconsiders it for some other reason. So decisions are made quickly, but then the implementation takes a lot more time because these decisions can be changed at any point in time. However, when it comes to decisions that are made consensually, it takes so much time, so much deliberation to build that consensus. So once the decision is made, it's nearly impossible to reverse it. People hold on to it for dear life. At the same time, because it takes so much time to come up with a decision, the implementation phase goes a lot quicker because by that point when the decision is made, everybody knows what to do, everybody's on board, so the implementation takes a lot less time. Now, Japan is another fascinating outlier on this chart, and it's kind of its own animal. It's highly hierarchical, yet it's still one of the most consensual cultures in the world. They came up with this system that's called Rinji, that is both hierarchical and consensual. So how does this work? So Rinji process starts somewhere at the mid-management level. First, they pass a proposal document with a new idea. Everybody reviews it, reads it, makes changes, makes suggestions, comments, and once they agree on what it should look like, everybody puts their stamp of approval. And then this document passed on to the next level. At this next level, the same process repeats. Every manager reviews it, makes their own contribution, and they negotiate it and go back and forth until they approve it. And then this document moves on to the next level and the next until it's either passed or not passed. So the stranger system is both consensual and hierarchical at the same time. Isn't that awesome? In fact, they actually have a software specifically developed for this Ringy purposes. It would distribute the document on one level and then pass it on to the next level and so on and so forth. In fact, I work with a Japanese company that's called Astellas. It's a pharmaceutical company. And I asked one of the American employees about this system, and they said that they actually use this system still, even in the United States. So to summarize, how do we bridge the gap? In a consensual culture, plan a little bit more time up front for the decision making to take its course, so to speak. Be patient and focus on how much faster the implementation is gonna go once this decision is made. And also try to stay in touch with the key decision makers, but don't push for a quick decision. In a top-down culture, you should not be expecting that your input is going to be solicited. That's one thing. Don't take it personally. If you're a decision maker or the boss, be explicit about how a decision will be made. Is it going to be a consultation, a majority vote, or something like that? And also try to be flexible and don't view any decisions as final, because as we talked about, decisions are made quickly, but they are also quickly changed in those types of cultures. The next domain we're going to be considering today is trust, and how trust building process differs from one culture to another. Erin Myer distinguishing societies where trust is task-based and societies where trust is based on relationships. Psychologists actually distinguish two types of trust, cognitive and affective. Our trust is based on cognition whenever we trust a person because we know they're competent, we know they have the credentials, we're confident in their skills and abilities that are relevant to that specific task. It's kind of, I know that you can do it and therefore I trust you. On the other hand, sometimes we trust people just because we like them, and this is affective trust. It is based on emotions such as closeness, friendship, empathy, and so on and so forth. Throughout the world, personal relationships and friendships are all built on this affective trust, but business relationships is where the cultural differences come into play. In task-based cultures, people learn to separate business from personal, whereas in relationship-based cultures, business is always personal. When people strike business deals in task-based cultures, they would discuss the terms of the deal, would go over the details, they would pretty much get to business almost immediately. In relationship-based cultures, no one's going to do business with you before they know you personally. One American company, US, is actually a task-based culture. It was trying to acquire an Argentinian firm, and Argentina belongs to one of the relationship-based cultures. So the Argentinian team flew over to the United States for negotiations, and the meeting started well. The Americans greeted their Argentinian colleagues, and then they quickly get to business that very morning. During 3 days of very intense and very difficult negotiations, the group was slowly but surely moving through the agenda items and make decisions. They were taking very, very short pauses between the meetings throughout the day, and at around 7 p.m., the Americans would head home, and the Argentinians would go to the hotel. And that was going on for 3 days in a row. After these 3 days, the American team was very happy with everything that they had accomplished. These short lunches and a very, very tight schedule was meant as a sign of respect for Argentinians who have taken their time to come to the United States. The American team wanted to move as quickly as possible, again, as a sign of respect that they're not taking up so much time of the Argentinians. But the Argentinian team did not feel that great about their negotiations. Their feedback was, yes, everything was certainly organized, everything was certainly efficient, but at the end of 3 days, we didn't really get to know who these Americans were, and we were wondering if they would make good partners for us. Next, the American team was invited to Argentina to continue those negotiations. And although the days were packed with meetings, their meals were very long. Lunches would often go for an hour or even more, and the evenings would extend to the late night. The Argentinians were taking this as an opportunity to share good food and conversation with their American colleagues to get to know them better. But the American team did not take it that way. But we were very uncomfortable, recalls one of the members of the American team. As the first lunch stretched on, we started looking at our watches and shifting around in our chairs. We were worried about how we were possibly going to complete what we needed to accomplish. We were wondering if, in the middle of these socializing marathons, if the Argentinians were actually taking these negotiations seriously. The deal was eventually done, but this story clearly illustrates how differently people do business in task-based versus relationship-based cultures. Granted, in America, we do have something that we call ice-breaking exercises. And usually they happen in the beginning of the business meetings. People would ask, oh, how everybody's doing, what did you do on the weekend, and things like that. But they usually take a couple minutes from the entire meeting, and then we would get straight to business. So the timeline would look something like this. A very short time for an icebreaker, and then the rest of it is going to be business. In relationship-based cultures, you'd likely be invited for a meal first. Maybe in my culture, they would probably take you to sauna or a nightclub, or they would make you drink vodka and have long conversations all night. Joking, not joking. They would make you drink vodka for sure. But the idea is that they would likely to take you to a place where you can let go, where you can drop your guard and just be yourself. No one is going to be judging your professionalism. So don't be afraid to make a fool of yourself or get too drunk. That's kind of the point. They want to see who you are as a person, and they want to know that you have nothing to hide. So feel free to let go in this type of culture. And once trust is established and you like each other, actually everything business related will go a lot quicker and a lot smoother. So the timeline is going to look something like this. A very long time for relationship building, but then when it comes to business operations, just because you are you know this person so well and you like that person, it's easier for each of you to make concessions to show your respect and your appreciation. Therefore, the business related stuff is going to not take as much time as if it would if you were just strangers. The difference in these two approaches to building trust is rooted in the differences between individualist and collectivist societies. Again, I don't know if we have talked about it already as you watch this, or if we're going to be talking about it a little bit later on, but again, there's going to be a longer discussion of that. But keep in mind that in collectivist societies, trust in business relationships is built through building personal relationships with the people specifically that you work with. And this trust is more affective based on emotions. In individualist societies, on another hand, trust is in business relationships is built through business interactions themselves. If you show me a proven record of successful operations, then I trust you. It's more like evidence-based. So here are a few tips on bridging the gap. If you are trying to build trust in a task-based society, again, demonstrate the proven record, follow through on your commitments, report on your accomplishments. Don't assume that a friendly conversation isn't indicative of a deeper friendship. These are the cultures where friendliness with strangers is considered fine, but then when you trying to get through, you realize that it is not as easy. If you're building trust in a relationship-based culture, then don't be afraid to show your authentic self. Don't be afraid to let go. Also, don't get down to business until you establish this rapport, this relationship. How do you do this? Well, a good thing to start is with finding something that you have in common with the person that you're trying to build relationship with. Also, don't assume that there is no soft center under a hard shell. Usually people from relationship based cultures come off as a little bit hostile to the outsiders, to the people that they don't know, but that's not the case. Usually as you get to know them and as they get to know you, they open up, and it's usually they're very nice people, even though it doesn't seem that way from the first impression. The last dimension in Erin Myer's book is scheduling, and it has to do with our assumptions about time. Perhaps you have that one friend who is always late and always is canceling plans the last minute. It's super annoying. Or maybe you are that annoying friend. Or you may have a friend who's like so rigid, so structural, so punctual that it drives you nuts. For some people, being 30 minutes late is not a big deal, whereas others are always on time. So there are differences between people in how punctual or not punctual they are. And in the same way, there are differences between cultures. We all know that there's this stereotype that Germans are very punctual. And those of you who have had experience with Latin America or Latin Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy, you probably noticed how slow their service was, and that being 1 hour late for something is not a big deal in these cultures. Depending on their assumptions about time, cultures can be described as monochronic or linear time, or M time, and polychronic or P time or flexible time cultures. In monochronic or linear time cultures, one of them is the United States actually, people tend to do one thing at a time. They tend to stick to deadlines, and they approach their planning and scheduling from a clock or a calendar perspective. Let's say this has to be done by 6 p.m. or this has to be completed by August 24th. They value organization over flexibility. If you're in a meeting, there is an agenda, and if something pops up that was not on the agenda, it is likely that people in the meeting would suggest to move this item to next meeting's agenda. At the same time, in polychronic or P cultures, people tend to multitask, do multiple things at the same time, and their deadlines are relatively flexible. When they plan, they usually base their plans based on events. For example, at lunch, by dinner, when cows come home, rather than give you an actual time and date. And they kind of take life as it goes. They value flexibility over structure. And when someone raises an issue that wasn't on the meeting agenda, they're likely to address it on the spot. Erin Myer uses an example of a tree trunk to explain how people use meeting agenda in P cultures versus M cultures. So this dotted line on the left represents a plan in or a meeting agenda in a monochronic culture. Very straightforward, one item after another. This little tree on the right, it represents a meeting agenda in a polychronic culture. So it's kind of the main line is a springboard, or the trunk of a tree, but there may be additional issues that arise as we go, and we're going to be addressing them as we go. So if you have a meeting plan like this, God knows how much time it's going to take. So it makes sense that their plans are flexible, their timing is flexible. But why do cultures differ like this? Wouldn't it be more convenient if people had concrete plans and stick to them? Wouldn't it be great if everything would happen on time? I think it would be amazing, but this has to do, the way people see and approach timing has to do with a country's or a culture's history in its development. For example, Germany was one of the first countries experiencing the Industrial Revolution, very early industrialization. Imagine yourself being an automotive factory worker in the 18th century. If you come a few minutes late, the entire line that you operate would not start working. And that means very tangible financial losses, right? So to this day, the perception of time in Germany is partially rooted in this early impact of industrialization, where every worker was supposed to be in place at a precisely appointed moment. At the same time, even to this day, many countries around the world remain agrarian. You can plan all you want that you're going to harvest your crops by August 16. But if they're not ripened by then, what will you do? Another reason why many cultures around the world that we call polychronic don't place as much importance on deadlines and specific timing is their history of revolutions, wars, uh, natural disasters, things that disrupt the society to the extent that they can no longer live their life the way they used to. The more often that happens to a culture, the less likely they are to rely on set in stone plans and deadlines and things like that. Life just gets in the way for these people constantly. And you can plan all you want, but if you're every time a new government comes in and they change all the regulations, the constitutions, the monetary policies, it makes no sense to plan far ahead. That's just how it's been historically with most of those countries. And if you look at this map, most of the developing countries are still polychronic. And it is the developed countries, the countries that are rich, stable, these countries can actually afford to plan ahead because they're a lot more stable and a lot less influenced by revolutions, wars, natural disasters, and so on and so forth. So countries that are behind economically, they are all in red, polychronic. So it really makes sense why they're polychronic cultures. It makes no sense for them to set their plans in stone because things will likely change a lot. Luckily, cultural differences in scheduling are one of the easiest to adapt to. And here are some tips. If you are in a linear time culture, it's easy, just arrive on time and end your meetings or whatever, the appointments on time. If you're late, just let everybody else know so they can plan accordingly. Always use an agenda, and an issue that's raised during the meeting that is not on the agenda, just move it to the next meeting. If you're in a flexible time culture, put relationships before deadlines. It is more important. Have an open agenda, use it as a springboard for additional agenda items, and be open to discussing the items that were not initially planned to be discussed. If you really need others to arrive on time for some reason, you can use something like a game. Whoever arrives more than 5 minutes late would put, I don't know, $1 into our jar that we could use later on for drinks, for cookies, and stuff like that. So you can encourage this. but don't require this unless this is necessary. So today we've talked about the cultural dimensions by Erin Myer, and before we end this session, I wanted to remind you about a few things. First of all, I'd recommend looking at each country's position on a given scale relative to your own country, rather than considering that country's absolute position. If we look at this picture, technically the United States, blue, and Germany, the orange dot, are both low context relative to all other cultures. However, if you are an American working in Germany, you'll definitely feel like Germany is a high context culture, no matter its absolute score on the scale. So when you're using these dimensions, think where a country is located relative to your own culture. Second, I want you to remember that there are always individual differences between people, even within the same countries. These scale represent the averages or acceptable ranges within a given culture. So here's, for example, where the Dutch and the British are located on the negative feedback scale. Certainly, there are Dutch people who are just as reserved as the British in their negative feedback, and certainly there are the British people who are just as direct in their negative feedback as Dutch people. So these ranges will overlap to a certain degree, but on average, the Dutch are more direct than the British. Thirdly, cultures as well as norms, traditions, they're all dynamic. They're not set in stone. They change over time due to changing life circumstances. These include things like globalization, new challenges, new threats, Western cultural influences, immigrations, changes even in a country's demographics. Here's a 2018 study by Dutch and German researchers. They looked at the two Hofstede dimensions, collectivism versus individualism, and indulgence versus restraint, or in other words, joy versus duty. So they actually found that as generations replace, we are becoming more individualistic and we're moving away from collectivism. And that makes perfect sense. As the technology is developing, we no longer need other people as badly as we used to in order to survive. The pandemic actually demonstrated that we can be perfectly fine not even leaving our homes. We can get things delivered, get things done without needing to interact with other people person to person. Another thing that they found is our duty joy orientation has moved from duty away from duty towards joy more. And again, because of all the technological improvements that we now have in our lives, we now have a lot more time to be considering things that bring us joy. And even the large corporations like the one I work with, they encourage employees to take more PTO, to have a little bit more fun, to take things like mental health day. They implement flexible PTO, remote work, everything that can make you feel a little bit more free and gives you a little bit better work-time balance. So the bottom line, what I was trying to say here, is that even though a culture is a massive thing that affects everything around us, it is also affected by everything around us. And as life changes, the cultures also change.